Section 47 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. A Link Supplied. Upon his bloody finger he doth wear a precious ring. Titus Andronicus. Make me to see it, or at the least so prove it, that the probation bear no hinge nor loop to hang a doubt on. Othello. Mr. Gryce did not believe that Imogene Dare had visited Mrs. Clemmens before the assault, or indeed had held any communication with her. Therefore, when Mansell declared that he had never told his aunt of the attachment between himself and this young lady, the astute detective at once drew the conclusion that the widow had never known of that attachment, and consequently that the words which the prisoner had overheard must have referred not to himself, as he supposed, but to some other man, and if to some other man, why the only one with whom Miss Dare's name was at that time associated, in other words, to Mr. Orcutt. Now it was not easy to measure the importance of a conclusion like this, for whilst there would have been nothing peculiar in this solitary woman, with the few thousand in the bank, boasting of her power to separate her nephew from the lady of his choice, there was everything that was significant in her using the same language in regard to Miss Dare and Mr. Orcutt. Nothing but the existence of some unsuspected bond between herself and the great lawyer could have accounted, first, for her feeling on the subject of his marriage, and secondly, for the threat of interference contained in her very emphatic words, a bond which, while evidently not that of love, was still of a nature to give her control over his destiny, and make her, in spite of her lonely condition, the selfish and determined arbitrator of his fate. What was that bond? A secret shared between them? The knowledge on her part of some fact in Mr. Orcutt's past life, which, if revealed, might serve as an impediment to his marriage. In consideration that the great mystery to be solved was what motive Mr. Orcutt could have had for killing this woman, an answer to this question was manifestly of the first importance. But before proceeding to take any measure to ensure one, Mr. Gryce sat down and seriously asked himself whether there was any known fact, circumstantial or otherwise, which refused to fit into the theory that Mr. Orcutt actually committed this crime with his own hand, and at the time he was seen to cross the street and enter Mrs. Clemmens' house. For whereas the most complete chain of circumstantial evidence does not necessarily prove the suspected party to be guilty of a crime, the least break in it is fatal to his conviction, and Mr. Gryce wished to be as fair to the memory of Mr. Orcutt as he would have been to the living man. Beginning, therefore, with the earliest incidents of that fatal day, he called up, first, the letter which the widow had commenced but never lived to finish. It was a suggestive epistle. It was addressed to her most intimate friend, and showed in the few lines written a certain foreboding or apprehension of death remarkable under the circumstances. Mr. Gryce recalled one of its expressions. "There are so many," wrote she, "to whom my death would be more than welcome." So many? Many is a strong word. Many means more than one, more than two. Many means three at least. Now, where were the three? Hildreth, of course, was one. Mansell might very properly be another, but who was the third? To Mr. Gryce but one name suggested itself in reply. So far, then, his theory stood firm. Now what was the next fact known? The milkman stopped with his milk. That was at 11:30. He had to wait a few minutes, from which it was concluded she was upstairs when he rapped. Was it at this time she was interrupted in her letter writing? If so, she probably did not go back to it, for when Mr. Hildreth called, some 15 minutes later, she was on the spot to open the door. Their interview was short. It was also stormy. Medicine was the last thing she stood in need of. Besides, her mind was evidently preoccupied. Showing him the door, she goes back to her work, and being deaf, does not notice that he does not leave the house as she expected. Consequently, her thoughts go on unhindered, and her condition being one of anger, she mutters aloud and bitterly to herself as she flits from dining room to kitchen in her labor of serving up her dinner. The words she made use of have been overheard, and here another point appears. For whereas her temper must have been disturbed by the demand which had been made upon her the day before by her favorite relative and heir, her expressions of wrath at this moment were not leveled against him, but against a young lady who is said to have been a stranger to her, her language being, "You think you are going to marry him, Imogene Dare, but I tell you, you never shall, not while I live." Her chief grievance, then, and the one thing uppermost in her thoughts, even at a time when she felt that there were many who desired her death, lay in this fact that a young and beautiful woman had manifested, as she supposed, a wish to marry Mr. Orcutt. The word "him," which she had used, necessarily referring to the lawyer, as she knew nothing of Imogene's passion for her nephew. But this is not the only point into which it is necessary to inquire. For to believe Mr. Orcutt guilty of this crime, one must also believe that all the other persons who had been accused of it were truthful in their explanations which they gave of the events which had seemingly connected them with it. Now, were they? Take the occurrence of that critical moment when the clock stood at 5 minutes to 12. If Mr. Hildreth is to be believed, he was at that instant in the widow's front hall, musing on his disappointment and arranging his plans for the future. The tramp, if those who profess to have watched him are to be believed, was on the kitchen portico, Craig Mansell on the dining room doorstep, Imogene Dare before her telescope in Professor Darling's observatory. Mr. Hildreth, with 2 doors closed between him and the back of the house, knew nothing of what was said or done there, but the tramp heard loud talking. And Craig Mansell, the actual voice of the widow raised in words which were calculated to mislead him into thinking she was engaged in angry altercation with the woman he loved. What do all three do then? Mr. Hildreth remains where he is. The tramp skulks away through the front gate. Craig Mansell rushes back to the woods. And Imogene Dare? She has turned her telescope toward Mrs. Clemmens' cottage, and being on the side of the dining room door, sees the flying form of Craig Mansell, and marks it till it disappears from her sight. Is there anything contradictory in these various statements? No. Everything, on the contrary, that is reconcilable. Let us proceed, then. What happens a few minutes later? Mr. Hildreth, tired of seclusion and anxious to catch the train, opens the front door and steps out. The tramp, skulking around some other back door, does not see him. Imogene, with her eye on Craig Mansell, now vanishing into the woods, does not see him. Nobody sees him. He goes, and the widow, for a short interval, is as much alone as she believed herself to be a minute or two before, when 3 men stood, unseen by each other, at each of the 3 doors of her house. What does she do now? Why, she finishes preparing her dinner, and then, observing that the clock is slow, proceeds to set it right. Fatal task! Before she has had an opportunity to finish it, the front door is opened again. Mr. Orcutt has come in, and, tempted perhaps by her defenseless position, catches up a stick of wood from the fireplace and, with one blow, strikes her down at his feet, and rushes forth again with tidings of her death. Now, is there anything in all this that is contradictory? No. there is only some thing left out. In the whole of his description of what went on in the widow's house, there has been no mention made of the ring. The ring which it is conceded was either in Craig Mansell's or Imogene Dare's possession the evening before the murder, and which was found on the dining room floor within 10 minutes after the assault took place. If Mrs. Clemmens' exclamations are to be taken as an attempt to describe her murderer, then the ring must have been on the hand which was raised against her. And how could that have been if the hand was that of Mr. Orcutt? Unimportant as it seemed, the discovery of this ring on the floor, taken with the exclamations of the widow, make a break in the chain that is fatal to Mr. Gryce's theory. Yet does it? The consternation displayed by Mr. Orcutt when Imogene claimed the ring and put it on her finger may have had a deeper significance than was thought at the time. Was there any way in which he could have come into possession of it before she did? And could it have been that he had had it on his hand when he struck the blow? Mr. Gryce bent all his energies to inquire. First, where was the ring when the lovers parted in the woods the day before the murder? Evidently in Mr. Mansell's coat pocket. Imogene had put it there, and Imogene had left it there. But Mansell did not know it was there, so took no pains to look after its safety. It accordingly slipped out. But when? Not while he slept, or it would have been found in the hut. Not while he took the path to his aunt's house, or it would have been found in the lane, or at best on the dining room doorstep. When, then? Mr. Gryce could think of but one instant, and that was when the young man threw his coat from one arm to the other at the corner of the house toward the street. If it rolled out, then, it would have been under an impetus, and, as the cloak was flung from the right arm to the left, the ring would have flown in that direction of the gate, and fallen, perhaps, directly on the walk in front of the house. If it had, its presence in the dining room seemed to show it had been carried there by Mr. Orcutt, since he was the next person who went into the house. But did it fall there? Mr. Gryce took the only available means to find out. Sending for Horace Byrd, he said to him, "You were on the courthouse steps when Mr. Orcutt left and crossed over to the widow's house?" "Yes, sir." "Were you watching him? Could you describe his manner as he entered the house, how he opened the gate, or whether he stopped to look about him before going in?" "No, sir," returned Byrd. "My eyes may have been on him, but I don't remember anything especial that he did." Somewhat disappointed, Mr. Gryce went to the District Attorney and put to him the same question. The answer he received from him was different. With a gloomy contraction of his brow, Mr. Ferris said: "Yes, I remember his look and his appearance very well. He stepped briskly, as he always did, and carried his head. Wait!" he suddenly exclaimed, giving the detective a look in which excitement and decision were strangely blended. "You think Mr. Orcutt committed this crime? That he left us standing on the courthouse steps and crossed the street to Mrs. Clemmens' house with the deliberate intention of killing her, and leaving the burden of his guilt to be shouldered by the tramp? Now, you have called up a memory to me that convinces me this could not have been. Had he had any such infernal design in his breast, he would not have been likely to have stopped as he did to pick up something which he saw lying on the walk in front of Mrs. Clemmens' house." "And did Mr. Orcutt do that?" inquired Mr. Gryce, with admirable self-control. "Yes, I remember it now distinctly. It was just as he entered the gate. A man meditating a murder of this sort would not be likely to notice a pin lying in his path, much less pause to pick it up." "How if it were a diamond ring?" "A diamond ring?" "Mr. Ferris," said the detective gravely, "you have just supplied a very important link in the chain of evidence against Mr. Orcutt. The question is, how could the diamond ring which Miss Dare is believed to have dropped into Mr. Mansell's coat pocket have been carried into Mrs. Clemmens' house without the agency of either herself or Mr. Mansell? I think you have just shown," and the able detective, in a few brief sentences, explained the situation to Mr. Ferris, together with the circumstances of Mansell's flight, as gleaned by him in his conversation with the prisoner. The District Attorney was sincerely dismayed. The guilt of the renowned lawyer was certainly assuming positive proportions. Yet, true to his friendship for Mr. Orcutt, he made one final effort to controvert the arguments of the detective, and quietly said: "You profess to explain how the ring might have been carried into Mrs. Clemmens' house, but how do you account for the widow having used an exclamation which seems to signify it was on the hand which she saw lifted against her life?" "By the fact that it was on that hand." "Do you think that probable if the hand was Mr. Orcutt's?" "Perfectly so. Where else would he be likely to put it in the preoccupied state of mind in which he was? In his pocket? The tramp might have done that, but not the gentleman." Mr. Ferris looked at the detective with almost an expression of fear. "And how came it to be on the floor if Mr. Orcutt put it on his finger?" "By the most natural process in the world. The ring made for Miss Dare's third finger was too large for Mr. Orcutt's little finger, and so slipped off when he dropped the stick of wood from his hand." "And he left it lying where it fell?" "He probably did not notice its loss. If, as I suppose, he had picked it up and placed it on his finger mechanically, its absence at such a moment would not be observed. Besides, what clue could he suppose a diamond ring he had never seen before, and which he had on his finger but an instant, would offer in a case like this?" "You reason close," said the District Attorney. "Too close," he added, as he recalled with painful distinctness the look and attitude of Mr. Orcutt at the time the ring was first brought into public notice, and realized that so might a man comport himself who, conscious of this ring's association with the crime he had just secretly perpetrated, sees it claimed and put on the finger of the woman he loves. Mr. Gryce, with his usual intuition, seemed to follow the thoughts of the District Attorney. "If our surmises are correct," he remarked, "it was a grim moment for the lawyer when, secure in his immunity from suspicion, he saw Miss Dare come upon the scene with eager inquiries concerning this murder. To you, who had not the clue, it looked as if he feared she was not as innocent as she should be. But if you will recall the situation now, I think you will see that his agitation can only be explained by his apprehension of her intuitions and an alarm lest her interest sprang from some mysterious doubt of himself." Mr. Ferris shook his head with a gloomy air, but did not respond. "Miss Dare tells me," the detective resumed, "that his first act upon their meeting again at his house was to offer himself to her in marriage. Now you, or any one else, would say this was to show he did not mistrust her, but I say it was to find out if she mistrusted him." Still Mr. Ferris remained silent. "The same reasoning will apply to what follows," continued Mr. Gryce. "You cannot reconcile the thought of his guilt with his taking the case of Mansell and doing all he could to secure his acquittal. But you will find it easier to do so when I tell you that, without taking into consideration any spark of sympathy which he might feel for the man falsely accused of his crime, he knew from Imogene's lips that she would not survive the condemnation of her lover, and that, besides this, his only hope of winning her for his wife lay in the gratitude he might awaken in her if he succeeded in saving his rival." "You are making him out a great villain," murmured Mr. Ferris, bitterly. "And was not that the language of his own countenance as he lay dying?" inquired the detective. Mr. Ferris could not say no. He had himself been too deeply impressed by the sinister look he had observed on the face of his dying friend. He therefore confined himself to remarking, not without sarcasm, "And now for the motive of this hideous crime, for I suppose your ingenuity has discovered one before this." "It will be found in his love for Miss Dare," returned the detective, "but just how I am not prepared to day to say." His love for Miss Dare? What had this plain and homespun Mrs. Clemmens to do with his love for Miss Dare? She was an interference. How? Ah, that, sir, is the question. So then you do not know? Mr. Gryce was obliged to shake his head. The District Attorney drew himself up. "Mr. Gryce," said he, "the charge which has been made against this eminent man demands the very strongest of proof in order to substantiate it. The motive, especially, must be shown to have been such as to offer a complete excuse for suspecting him. No trivial or imaginary reason for his wishing this woman out of the world will answer in his case. You must prove that her death was absolutely necessary to the success of his dearest hope, or your reasoning will only awaken distrust in the minds of all who hear it. The fame of a man like Mr. Orcutt is not to be destroyed by a passing word of delirium, or a specious display of circumstantial evidence such as you evolve from the presence of the ring on the scene of the murder." "I know it," allowed Mr. Gryce, "and that is why I have asked for a week." "Then you still believe you can find such a motive?" The smile which Mr. Gryce bestowed upon the favored object then honored by his gaze haunted the District Attorney for the rest of the week. Chapter 41. Of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 42. Consultations. That he should die is worthy policy, but yet we want color for his death. 'Tis meet he be condemned by course of law. Henry VI. Mr. Gryce was perfectly aware that the task before him was a difficult one. To be himself convinced that Mr. Orcutt had been in possession of a motive sufficient to account for, if not excuse, this horrible crime was one thing. To find out that motive and make it apparent to the world was another. But he was not discouraged. Summoning his two subordinates, he laid the matter before them. "I am convinced," said he, "that Mrs. Clemmens was a more important person to Mr. Orcutt than her plain appearance and humble manner of life would suggest. Do either of you know whether Mr. Orcutt's name has ever been associated with any private scandal, the knowledge of which might have given her power over him?" "I do not think he was that kind of man," said Byrd. "Since morning I have put myself in the way of such persons as I saw disposed to converse about him, and though I have been astonished to find how many there are who say they never quite liked or altogether trusted this famous lawyer, I have heard nothing said in any way derogatory to his private character. Indeed, I believe, as far as the ladies were concerned, he was particularly reserved. Though a bachelor, he showed no disposition to marry, and until Miss Dare appeared on the scene, was not known to be even attentive to one of her sex. Some one, however, I forgot who, told me that for a short time he was sweet on a certain Miss Pratt," remarked Hickory. "Pratt? Where have I heard that name?" murmured Byrd to himself. "But nothing came of it," Hickory continued. "She was not over and above smart, they say, and though pretty enough, did not hold his fancy. Some folks declare she was so disappointed she left town." "Pratt, Pratt," repeated Byrd to himself. "Ah, I know!" he suddenly exclaimed. "While I stood amongst the crowd the morning Miss Clemmens was murdered, I remember overhearing some one say how hard she was on the Pratt girl." "Humph!" ejaculated Mr. Gryce. "The widow was hard on any one Mr. Orcutt chose to admire." "I don't understand it," said Byrd. "Nor I," rejoined Mr. Gryce. "But I intend to before the week is out." Then abruptly, "When did Mrs. Clemmens come to this town?" "15 years ago," replied Byrd. "And Orcutt, when did he first put in an appearance here?" "At very much the same time, I believe." "Humph! And did they seem to be friends at that time?" "Some say yes, some say no." "Where did he come from, have you learned?" "From some place in Nebraska, I believe." "And she?" "Why, she came from some place in Nebraska, too." "The same place?" "That we must find out." Mr. Gryce mused for a moment, then he observed: "Mr. Orcutt was renowned in his profession. Do you know any thing about his career, whether he brought a reputation for his ability with him, or whether his fame was entirely made in this place?" "I think it was made here. Indeed, I have heard that it was in this court he pleaded his first case. Don't you know more about it, Hickory?" "Yes. Mr. Ferris told me this morning that Orcutt had not opened a law book when he came to this town; that he was a country schoolmaster in some uncivilized district out West, and would never have been anything more, perhaps, if the son of old Stephen Orcutt had not died, and thus made a vacancy in the law office here, which he was immediately sent for to fill." "Stephen Orcutt? He was the uncle of this man, wasn't he?" "Yes." "And quite a lawyer, too." "Yes, but nothing like Tremont B. He was successful from the start. Had a natural aptitude, I suppose. Must have had to pick up the profession in the way he did." "Boys," cried Mr. Gryce, after another short ruminative pause, "the secret we want to know is of long standing indeed. I should not be surprised if it were connected with his life out West. I will tell you why I think so. For 10 years Mrs. Clemmens has been known to put money in the bank regularly every week. Now, where did she get that money? From Mr. Orcutt, of course. What for? In payment for the dinner he usually took with her? No, in payment of her silence concerning a past he desired kept secret." "But they have been here 15 years, and she has only received money for 10." "She has only put money in the bank for 10. She may have been paid before that, and may not. I do not suppose he was in a condition to be very lavish at the outset of his career." "You advise us, then, to see what we can make out of his early life out West?" "Yes, and I will see what I can make out of hers. The link which connects the two will be found. Mr. Orcutt did not say it was all for you, Imogene, for nothing." And dismissing the two young men, Mr. Gryce proceeded to the house of Mr. Orcutt, where he entered upon an examination of such papers and documents as were open to his inspection, in the hope of discovering some allusion to the deceased lawyer's early history. But he was not successful. Neither did a like inspection of the widow's letters bring any new facts to light. The only result which seemed to follow these efforts was an increased certainty on his part that some dangerous secret lurked in a past that was so determinedly hidden from the world, and resorting to the only expedient now left to him, he resolved to consult Miss Furman, as being the only person who professed to have any acquaintance with Mrs. Clemmens, before she came to Sibley. To be sure, she had already been questioned by the coroner, but Mr. Gryce was a man who had always found that the driest well could be made to yield a drop or two more of water if the bucket were dropped by a dexterous hand. He accordingly prepared himself for a trip to Utica. End of chapter 42. '49 of Handed Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 43. Mrs. Furman. Hark, she speaks. I will set down what comes from her. Heaven knows what she has known. Macbeth. Miss Furman, I believe, the staid, pleasant-faced lady whom we know, but who is looking older and considerably more careworn than when we saw her at the coroner's inquest, rose from her chair in her cozy sitting room and surveyed her visitor curiously. "I am Mr. Gryce," the genial voice went on. "Perhaps the name is not familiar." "I've never heard it before," was the short but not ungracious reply. "Well, then, let me explain," said he. "You are a relative of the Mrs. Clemmens who was so foully murdered in Sibley, are you not? Pardon me, but I see you are. Your expression speaks for itself." How could he have seen her expression was a mystery to Miss Furman, for his eyes, if not attention, were seemingly fixed upon some object in quite a different portion of the room. "You must, therefore," he pursued, "be in a state of great anxiety to know who her murderer was. Now, I am in that same state, madam. We are, therefore, in sympathy, you see." The respectful smile and peculiar intonation with which these last words were uttered robbed them of their familiarity and allowed Miss Furman to perceive his true character. "You are a detective," said she, and as he did not deny it, she went on, "You say I must be anxious to know who my cousin's murderer was. Has Craik Mansell, then, been acquitted?" "A verdict has not been given," said the other. "His trial has been adjourned in order to give him an opportunity to choose a new counsel." Miss Firman motioned her visitor to be seated, and at once took a chair herself. "What do you want with me?" she asked, with characteristic bluntness. The detective was silent. It was for a moment, but in that moment he seemed to read to the bottom of this woman's mind. "Well," said he, "I will tell you. You believe Craik Mansell to be innocent?" "I do," she returned. "Very well, so do I." "Let me shake hands with you," was her abrupt remark, and without a smile she reached forth her hand, which he took with equal gravity. This ceremony over, he remarked with a cheerful mien, "We are fortunately not in a court of law, so we can talk freely together. Why do you think Mansell innocent? I am sure the evidence has not been much in his favor." "Why do you think him innocent?" was the brisk retort. "I have talked with him." "Ah!" "I have talked with Miss Dare." A different "ah" this time. "And I was present when Mr. Orcutt breathed his last." The look she gave was like cold water on Mr. Gryce's secretly growing hopes. "What has that to do with it?" she wonderingly exclaimed. The detective took another tone. "You did not know Mr. Orcutt, then?" he inquired. "I had not that honor," was the formal reply. "You have never, then, visited your cousin in Sibley?" "Yes, I was there once, but that did not give me an acquaintance with Mr. Orcutt." "Yet he went almost every day to her house." "And he came while I was there, but that did not give me an acquaintance with him." "He was reserved, then, in his manners, uncommunicative, possibly morose?" "He was just what I would expect such a gentleman to be at the table with women like my cousin and myself." "Not morose, then, only reserved?" "Exactly," the short, quick bow of the amiable spinster seemed to assert. Mr. Gryce drew a deep breath. This well seemed to be destitute of even a drop of moisture. "Why do you ask me about Mr. Orcutt? Has his death in any way affected young Mansell's prospects?" "That is what I want to find out," declared Mr. Gryce. Then, without giving her time for another question, said, "Where did Mrs. Clemmens first make the acquaintance of Mr. Orcutt? Wasn't it in some town out West?" "Out West? Not to my knowledge, sir. I have always supposed she saw him first in Sibley." This well was certainly very dry. "Yet you are not positive that this is so, are you?" pursued the patient detective. "She came from Nebraska, and so did he. Now, why may they not have known each other out there?" "I did not know he came from Nebraska." "She has never talked about him, then?" "Never." Mr. Gryce drew another deep breath and let down his bucket again. "I thought your cousin spent her childhood in Toledo." "She did, sir." How came she go to Nebraska, then? Well, she was left an orphan and had to look out for herself. A situation in some way opened to her in Nebraska, and she went there to take it." "A situation at what?" "A waitress in some hotel." "Humph! And was she still a waitress when she married?" "Yes, I think so, but I am not sure about it or anything else in connection with her at that time. The subject was so painful we never discussed it." "Why painful?" "She lost her husband so soon." "But you can tell me the name of the town in which this hotel was, can you not?" "It was called Swanson then, but that was 15 years ago. Its name may have been changed since." Swanson. This was something to learn, but not much. Mr. Gryce returned to his first question. "You have not told me," said he, "why you believe Craik Mansell to be innocent." "Well," replied she, "I believe Craik Mansell to be innocent because he is the son of his mother. I think I know him pretty well, but I am certain I knew her. She was a woman who would go through fire and water to attain a purpose she thought right, but who would stop in the midst of any project the moment she felt the least doubt of its being just or wise. Craik has his mother's forehead and eyes, and no one will ever make me believe he has not her principles also." "I coincide with you, madam," remarked the attentive detective. "I hope the jury will," was her energetic response. He bowed and was about to attempt another question when an interruption occurred. Miss Furman was called from the room, and Mr. Gryce found himself left for a few moments alone. His thoughts, as he awaited her return, were far from cheerful, for he saw a long and tedious line of inquiry opening before him in the West, which, if it did not end in failure, promised to exhaust not only a week, but possibly many months, before certainty of any kind could be obtained. With Miss Dare on the verge of a fever, and Mansell in a position calling for the utmost nerve and self-control, this prospect looked anything but attractive to the benevolent detective, and, carried away by his impatience, he was about to give utterance to an angry ejaculation against the man he believed to be the author of all this mischief, when he suddenly heard a voice raised from some unknown quarter near by, saying in strange tones he was positive did not proceed from Miss Furman, "Was it Clemmens or was it Orcutt? Clemmens or Orcutt? I cannot remember." Naturally excited and aroused, Mr. Gryce rose and looked about him. A door stood ajar at his back. Hastening toward it, he was about to lay his hand on the knob when Miss Furman returned. "Oh, I beg you," she entreated. "That is my mother's room, and she is not at all well." "I was going to her assistance," asserted the detective, with grave composure. "She has just uttered a cry." "Oh, you don't say so!" exclaimed the unsuspicious spinster, and hurrying forward, she threw open the door herself. Mr. Gryce benevolently followed. "Why, she is asleep," protested Miss Furman, turning on the detective with a suspicious look. Mr. Gryce, with a glance toward the bed he saw before him, bowed with seeming perplexity. "She certainly appears to be," said he, "and yet I am positive she spoke but an instant ago. I can even tell you the words she used." "What were they?" asked the spinster, with something like a look of concern. "She said, 'Was it Clemmens or was it Orcutt? Clemmens or Orcutt? I cannot remember.'" "You don't say so! Poor Ma, she was dreaming. Come into the other room and I will explain." And leading the way back to the apartment they had left, she motioned him again toward a chair, and then said, "Ma has always been a very hale and active woman for her years, but this murder seems to have shaken her. To speak the truth, sir, she has not been quite right in her mind since the day I told her of it, and I often detect her murmuring words similar to those you have just heard." "Humph! And does she often use his name?" "Whose name?" "Mr. Orcutt's." "Why, yes, but not with any understanding of whom she is speaking." "Are you sure?" inquired Mr. Gryce, with that peculiar impressiveness he used on great occasions." "What do you mean?" "I mean," returned the detective dryly, "that I believe your mother does know what she was talking about when she links the name of Mr. Orcutt with that of your cousin who was murdered. They belonged together. Mr. Orcutt was her murderer." "Mr. Orcutt?" "Hush!" cried Mr. Gryce. "You will wake up your mother." And adapting himself to this emergency as to all others, he talked with the astounded and incredulous woman before him till she was in a condition not only to listen to his explanations, but to discuss the problem of a crime so seemingly without motive. He then said, with easy assurance: "Your mother does not know that Mr. Orcutt is dead?" "No, sir." "She does not even know he was counsel for Craik Mansell in the trial now going on?" "How do you know that?" inquired Miss Furman grimly. "Because I do not believe you have even told her that Craik Mansell was on trial." "Sir, you are a magician." "Have you, madam?" "No, sir, I have not." "Very good. What does she know about Mr. Orcutt, then, and why should she connect his name with Mrs. Clemmens?" "She knows he was her boarder, and that he was the first to discover she had been murdered." "That is not enough to account for her frequent repetition of his name." "You think not?" "I am sure not. Cannot your mother have some memories connected with his name of which you are ignorant?" "No, sir. We have lived together in this house for 25 years, and have never had a thought we have not shared together. Ma could not have known anything about him or Mary Ann which I did not." The words she has just spoken sprang from mental confusion. She is almost like a child sometimes. Mr. Gryce smiled. If the cream jug he happened to be gazing at on a tray near by had been full of cream, I am far from certain it would not have turned sour on the spot. "I grant the mental confusion," said he, "but why should she confuse those two names in preference to all others?" And with quiet persistence he remarked again: "She may be recalling some old fact of years ago. Was there never a time, even when you lived together, when she could have received some confidence from Mrs. Clemmens?" "Mary Ann?" "Mary Ann," came in querulous accents from the other room. "I wish you had not told me. Emily would be a better one to know your secret." It was a startling interruption to come just at that moment. The two surprised listeners glanced toward each other, and Miss Furman colored. "That sounds as if your surmise were true," she dryly observed. "Let us make an experiment," said he, and motioned her to re enter her mother's room, which she did with a precipitation that showed her composure had been sorely shaken by these unexpected occurrences. He followed her without ceremony. The old lady lay as before in a condition between sleeping and waking, and did not move as they came in. Mr. Gryce at once withdrew out of sight, and, with a finger on his lips, put himself in an attitude of waiting. Miss Furman, surprised and possibly curious, took her stand at the foot of the bed. A few minutes passed thus, during which a strange weariness seemed to settle upon the room. Then the old lady spoke again, this time repeating the words he had first heard, but in a tone which betrayed an increased perplexity. "Was it Clemmens or was it Orcutt? I wish some one would tell me." Instantly Mr. Gryce, with his soft tread, drew near to the old lady's side, and leaning over her, murmured gently: "I think it was Orcutt." Instantly the old lady breathed a deep sigh and moved. "Then her name was Mrs. Orcutt," said she, "and I thought you always called her Clemmens." Miss Furman, recoiling, stared at Mr. Gryce, on whose cheek a faint spot of red had appeared, a most unusual token of emotion with him. "Did she say it was Mrs. Orcutt?" he pursued, in the even tones he had before used. "She said—" But here the old lady opened her eyes, and seeing her daughter standing at the foot of her bed, turned away with a peevish air, and restlessly pushed her hand under the pillow. Mr. Gryce at once bent nearer. "She said," he suggested, with careful gentleness. But the old lady made no answer. Her hand seemed to have touched some object for which she was seeking, and she was evidently oblivious to all else. Miss Furman came round and touched Mr. Gryce on the shoulder. "It is useless," said she. "She is awake now, and you won't hear anything more. Come." And she drew the reluctant detective back again into the other room. "What does it all mean?" she asked, sinking into a chair. Mr. Gryce did not answer. He had a question of his own to put. "Why did your mother put her hand under her pillow?" he asked. "I don't know, unless it was to see if her big envelope was there." "Her big envelope?" "Yes, for weeks now, ever since she took to her bed, she has kept the paper in a big envelope under her pillow. What is in it I do not know, for she never seems to hear me when I inquire." "And have you no curiosity to find out?" "No, sir. Why should I? It might easily be my father's old letters sealed up, or, for that matter, be nothing more than a piece of blank paper. My mother is not herself, as I said before." "I should like a peep at the contents of that envelope," he declared. "You?" "Is there any name written on the outside?" "No." "It would not be violating any one's rights, then, if you opened it?" "Only my mother's, sir." "You say she is not in her right mind." "All the more reason why I should respect her whims and caprices." "Wouldn't you open it if she were dead?" "Yes." "Will it be very different, then, from what it is now? A father's letter, a blank piece of paper, what harm would there be in looking at them?" "My mother would know it if I took them away. It might excite and injure her." "Put another envelope in the place of this one, with a piece of paper folded up in it." "It would be a trick." "I know it. But if Craik Mansell can be saved even by a trick, I should think you would be willing to venture on one." "Craik Mansell? What has he got to do with the papers under my mother's pillow?" "I cannot say that he has any thing to do with them, but if he has, if, for instance, that envelope should contain not a piece of blank paper, or even the letters of your father, but such a document, say, as a certificate of marriage." "A certificate of marriage?" "Yes, between Mrs. Clemmens and Mr. Orcutt. It would not take much perspicacity to prophesy an acquittal for Craik Mansell." "Mary Ann, the wife of Mr. Orcutt? Oh, that is impossible!" exclaimed the agitated spinster. But even while making this determined statement, she turned a look full of curiosity and excitement toward the door which separated them from her mother's apartment. Mr. Gryce smiled in his wise way. "Less improbable things than that have been found to be true in this topsy-turvy world," said he. "Mrs. Clemmens might very well have been Mrs. Orcutt." "Do you really think so?" she asked, and yielding with sudden impetuosity to the curiosity of the moment, she at once dashed from his side and disappeared into her mother's room. Mr. Gryce's smile took on an aspect of triumph. It was some few moments before she returned, but when she did, her countenance was flushed with emotion. "I have it," she murmured, taking out a packet from under her apron and tearing it open with trembling fingers. A number of closely written sheets fell out. End of chapter 43. Section 50 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 44. The Widow Clemmens. Discovered. The secret that so long had hovered upon the misty verge of truth. Longfellow. "Well, and what have you to say?" It was Mr. Ferris who spoke. The week which Mr. Gryce had demanded for his inquiries had fully elapsed, and the three detectives stood before him ready with their report. It was Mr. Gryce who replied. "Sir," said he, "our opinions have not been changed by the discoveries which we have made. It was Mr. Orcutt who killed Mrs. Clemmens, and for the reason already stated, that she stood in the way of his marrying Miss Dare. Mrs. Clemmens was his wife." "His wife?" "Yes, sir, and what is more, she has been for years, before either of them came to Sibley, in fact." The District Attorney looked stunned. "It was while they lived West," said Byrd. "He was a poor schoolmaster, and she a waitress in some hotel. She was pretty then, and he thought he loved her. At all events, he induced her to marry him, and then kept it secret because he was afraid she would lose her place at the hotel, where she was getting very good wages. You see, he had the makings in him of a villain even then." "And was it a real marriage?" "There is a record of it," said Hickory. "And did he never acknowledge it?" "Not openly," said Byrd. "The commonness of the woman seemed to revolt him after he was married to her, and when in a month or so he received the summons East, which opened up before him the career of a lawyer, he determined to drop her and start afresh. He accordingly left town without notifying her, and actually succeeded in reaching the railway depot 20 miles away before he was stopped. But here, a delay occurring in the departure of the train, she was enabled to overtake him, and a stormy scene ensued. What its exact nature was, we, of course, cannot say, but from the results it is evident that he told her his prospects had changed, and with them his tastes and requirements, that she was not the woman he thought her, and that he could not and would not take her East with him as his wife, while she, on her side, displayed full as much spirit as he, and replied that if he could desert her like this, he wasn't the kind of man she could live with, and that he could go if he wished, only that he must acknowledge her claims upon him by giving her a yearly stipend according to his income and success. At all events, some such compromise was effected, for he came East, and she went back to Swanson. She did not stay there long, however, for the next we know she was in Sibley, where she set up her own little housekeeping arrangements under his very eye. More than that, she prevailed upon him to visit her daily, and even to take a meal at her house, her sense of justice seeming to be satisfied if he showed her this little attention, and gave to no other woman the place he denied her. It was the weakness shown in this last requirement that doubtless led to her death. She would stand anything but a rival. He knew this, and preferred crime to the loss of the woman he loved. "You speak very knowingly," said Mr. Ferris. "May I ask where you received your information?" It was Mr. Gryce who answered. "From letters. Mrs. Clemmens was one of those women who delight in putting their feelings on paper. Fortunately for us, such women are not rare. See here," and he pulled out before the District Attorney a pile of old letters in the widow's well-known handwriting. "Where did you find these?" asked Mr. Ferris. "Well," said Mr. Gryce, "I found them in a rather curious place. They were in the keeping of old Mrs. Furman, Miss Furman's mother. Mrs. Clemmens, or rather Mrs. Orcutt, got frightened some 2 years ago at the disappearance of her marriage certificate from the place where she had always kept it hidden, and thinking that Mr. Orcutt was planning to throw her off, she resolved to provide herself with a confidant capable of standing by her in case she wished to assert her rights. She chose old Mrs. Furman. Why, when her daughter would have been so much more suitable for the purpose, it is hard to tell. Possibly the widow's pride revolted from telling a woman of her own years the indignities she had suffered. However that may be, it was to the old lady she told her story and gave these letters, letters which, as you will see, are not written to any special person, but are rather the separate leaves of a journal which she kept to show the state of her feelings from time to time." "And this?" inquired Mr. Ferris, taking up a sheet of paper written in a different handwriting from the rest. "This is an attempt on the part of the old lady to put on paper the story which had been told her. She evidently thought herself too old to be entrusted with a secret so important, and fearing loss of memory or perhaps sudden death, took this means of explaining how she came into possession of her cousin's letters. 'Twas a wise precaution. Without it we would have missed the clue to the widow's journal, for the old lady's brain gave way when she heard of the widow's death, and had it not been for a special stroke of good luck on my part, we might have remained some time longer in ignorance of what very valuable papers she secretly held in her possession." "I will read the letters," said Mr. Ferris. Seeing from his look that he only waited their departure to do so, Mr. Gryce and his subordinates arose. "I think you will find them satisfactory," drawled Hickory. "If you do not," said Mr. Gryce, "then give a look at this telegram. It is from Swanson, and notifies us that a record of a marriage between Benjamin Orcutt, Mr. Orcutt's middle name was Benjamin, and Mary Mansell can be found in the old town books." Mr. Ferris took the telegram, the shade of sorrow settling heavier and heavier on his brow. "I see," said he. "I have got to accept your conclusions. Well, there are those among the living who will be greatly relieved by these discoveries. I will try and think of that." Yet after the detectives were gone, he sat down in solitude before these evidences of his friend's perfidy, and it was many long and dreary moments before he could summon up the courage to peruse them. But when he did, he found in them all that Mr. Gryce had promised. As my readers may feel some interest to know how the seeming widow bore the daily trial of her life, I will give a few extracts from these letters. The first bears date of 14 years back, and was written after she came to Sibley. November 8th, 1867. In the same town, within a stone's throw of the courthouse, where, they tell me, his business will soon take him almost every day. Isn't it a triumph? And am I not to be congratulated upon my bravery in coming here? He hasn't seen me yet, but I have seen him. I crept out of the house at nightfall on purpose. He was sauntering down the street, and he looked, it makes my blood boil to think of it, he looked happy. November 10th, 1867. Clemmens, Clemmens, that is my name, and I have taken the title of widow. What a fate for a woman with a husband in the next street! He saw me to-day. I met him in the open square, and I looked him right in the face. How he did quail! It does me good to think of it. Perk and haughty as he is, he grew as white as a sheet when he saw me, and though he tried to put on airs and carry it off with a high hand, he failed, just as I knew he would when he came to meet me on even ground. Oh, I'll have my way now, if I choose to stay in this place where I can keep my eye on him. He won't dare say no. The only thing I fear is that he will do me some secret mischief some day. His look was just murderous when he left me. February 24th, 1868. Can I stand it? I ask myself that question every morning when I get up. Can I stand it? To sit all alone in my little narrow room, and know that he is going about as gay as you please, with people who wouldn't look at me twice. It's awful hard, but it would be worse still to be where I couldn't see what he was up to. Then I should imagine all sorts of things. No, I will just grit my teeth and bear it. I'll get used to it after a while. October 7th, 1868. If he says he never loved me, he lies. He did, or why did he marry me? I never asked him to. He teased me into it, saying my saucy ways had bewitched him. A month after, It was common ways, rude ways, such ways as he wouldn't have in a wife. That's the kind of man he is. May 11th, 1869. One thing I will say of him, he don't pay no heed to women. He's too busy, I guess. He doesn't seem to think of anything but to get along, and he does get along remarkable. I am awful proud of him. He's taken to defending criminals lately. They almost all get off. October 5th, 1870. He pays me but a pittance. How can I look like anything, or hold my head up with the ladies here, if I cannot get enough together to buy me a new fall hat? I will not go to church looking like a farmer's wife. If I haven't any education or any manners, I am as good as anybody here if they but knew it, and deserve to dress as well. He must give me more money. November 2nd, 1870. No, he shan't give me a cent more. If I can't go to church, I will stay at home. He shan't say I stood in his way of becoming a great man. He is too good for me. I saw it to-day when he got up in the court to speak. I was there with a thick veil over my face, for I was determined to know whether he was as smart as folks say or not. And he just is. Oh, how beautiful he did look, and how everybody held their breaths while he was speaking. I felt like jumping up and saying, "This is my husband. We were married 3 years ago." Wouldn't I have raised a rumpus if I had? I guess the poor man was pleading, for he would not have been remembered very long after that. My husband! The thought makes me laugh. No other woman can call him that anyhow. He's mine, 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 and I mean he shall stay so. January 9th, 1871. I feel awful blue to-night. I have been thinking about those Hildreths, how they would like to have me dead, and so would Tremont, though he don't say nothing. I like to call him Tremont. It makes me feel as if he belonged to me. What if that wicked Gouverneur Hildreth should know I lived so much alone? I don't believe he would stop at killing me. And my husband, he is equal to telling him I have no protector. Oh, what a dreadful wickedness it is in me to put that down on paper. It isn't so, it isn't so. My husband wouldn't do me any harm if he could. If ever I'm found dead in my bed, it will be the work of that Toledo man, and of nobody else. March 2nd, 1872. I hope I am going to have some comfort now. Tremont has begun to pay me more money. He had to. He isn't a poor man any more, and when he moves into his big house, I am going to move into a certain little cottage I have found just around the corner. If I can't have no other pleasures, I will at least have a kitchen I can call my own, and a parlor too. What if there don't no company come to it? They would if they knew. I've just heard from Adelaide. She says Craik is getting to be a big boy, and is so smart. June 10th, 1872. What's the use of having a home? I declare I feel just like breaking down and crying. I don't want company. If women folks, they're always talking about their husbands and children, and if men, they're always saying, my wife this and my wife's that. But I do want him. It's my right. What if I couldn't say the 3 words to him that was agreeable? I could look at him and think, this splendid gentleman is my husband. I ain't so much alone in the world as folks think. I'll put on my bonnet and run down the street. Perhaps I'll see him sitting in the clubhouse window. Evening. I hate him. He has a hard, cruel, wicked heart. When I got to the clubhouse window, he was sitting there, so I just went walking by, and he saw me and came out and hustled me away with terrible words, saying he wouldn't have me hanging around where he was, that I had promised not to bother him, and that I must keep my word, or he would see me. He didn't say where, but it's easy enough to guess. So, he thinks he'll put an end to my coming to see him, does he? Well, perhaps he can, but if he does, he shall pay for it by coming to see me. I'll not sit day in and day out alone without the glimpse of a face I love. Not while I have a husband in the same town with me. He shall come, if it is only for a moment each day, or I'll dare everything and tell the world I am his wife. June 16th, 1872. He had to consent. Meek as I have been, he knows it won't do to rouse me too much. So today he came in to dinner, and he had to acknowledge it was a good one. Oh, how I did feel when I saw his face on the other side of the table! I didn't know whether I hated him or loved him, but I am sure now I hated him, for he scarcely spoke to me all the time he was eating, and when he was through, he went away just as a stranger would have done. He means to act like a boarder, and goodness me, he's welcome to it if he isn't going to act like a husband. The hard, selfish... Oh, I love him. August 5th, 1872. It is no use. I'll never be a happy woman. Tremont has been in so regularly to dinner lately, and shown me such a kind face, I thought I would venture upon a little familiarity. It was only to lay my hand upon his arm, but it made him very angry, and I thought he would strike me. Am I then actually hateful to him, or is he so proud he cannot bear the thought of my having the right to touch him? I looked in the glass when he went out. I am plain and homespun, that's a fact. Even my red cheeks are gone, and the dimples which once took his fancy. I shall never lay the tip of my finger on him again. February 13th, 1873. What shall I cook for him today? Something that he likes. It is my only pleasure to see how he does enjoy my meals. I should think they would choke him. They do me sometimes. But men are made of iron, ambitious men, anyhow. Little they care what suffering they cause, so long as they have a good time and get all the praises they want. He gets them more and more every day. He will soon be as far above me as if I had married the President himself. Oh, sometimes, when I think of it and remember he is my own husband, I just feel if some awful fate was preparing for him or me. June 7th, 1873. Would he send for me if he was dying? No, he hates me. He hates me. September 8th, 1874. Craik was here today. He is just going north to earn a few dollars in the logging business. What a keen eye he has for a boy of his years. I shouldn't wonder if he made a powerful smart man some day. If he's only good, too, and kind to his women folks, I shan't mind. But a smart man who is all for himself is an awful trial to those who love him. Don't I know? Haven't I suffered? Craik must never be like him. December 21st, 1875. $1,000. That's a nice little sum to have put away in the bank. So much I get out of my husband's fame. Anyhow, I think I will make my will, for I want Craik to have what I leave. He's a fine lad. February 19th, 1876. I was thinking the other day, suppose I did die suddenly, it would be dreadful to have the name of Clemmens put on my tombstone. But it would be. Tremont would never let the truth be known, if he had to rifle my dead body for my marriage certificate. What shall I do then? Tell anybody who I am? It seems just as if I couldn't. Either the whole world must know it, or just himself and me alone. Oh, I wish I had never been born. June 17th, 1876. Why wasn't I made handsome and fine and nice? Think where I would be if I was. I'd be in that big house of his, curtsying to all the grand folks as go there. I went to see it last night. It was dark as pitch in the streets, and I went into the gate and all around the house. I walked upon the piazza, too, and rubbed my hand along the window ledges and up and down the doors. It's mighty nice, all of it, and there shan't lie a square inch on that whole ground that my foot shan't go over. I wish I could get inside the house once. July 1st, 1876. I have done it. I went to see Mr. Orcutt's sister. I had a right. Isn't he away, and isn't he my boarder? And didn't I want to know when he was coming home? She's a good, soft-natured piece, and let me peek into the library without saying a word. What a room it is! I just felt like I'd been struck when I saw it and spied his chair sitting there, and all those books heaped round, and the fine things on the mantel-shelf, and the pictures on the walls. What would I do in such a place as that? I could keep it clean, but so could any gal he might hire. Oh me, oh me! I wish he'd give me a chance. Perhaps if he loved me, I might have learned to be quiet and nice like that silly sister of his. January 12th, 1877. Some women would take a heap of delight in having folks know they were the wife of a great man, but I find lots of pleasure in being so without folks knowing it. If I lived in his big house and was called Mrs. Orcutt, why, he wouldn't have nothing to be afraid of and might do as he pleased. But now he has to do what I please. Sometimes, when I sit down of an evening in my little sitting room to sew, I think how this famous man, whom everybody is afraid of, has to come and go just as humble me wants him to, and it makes me hug myself with pride. It's as if I had a string tied round his little finger, which I can pull now and then. I don't pull it much, but I do sometimes. March 30th, 1877. Gouverneur Hildreth is dead. I shall never be his victim at any rate. Shall I ever be the victim of anybody? I don't feel as if I cared now. For one kiss I would sell my life and die happy. There is young Gouverneur, but it will be years before he will be old enough to make me afraid of him. November 16th, 1878. I should think that Tremont would be lonely in that big house of his. If he had a heart, he would. They say he reads all the time. How can folks pore so over books? I can't. I'd rather sit in my chair and think. What story in all the books is equal to mine? April 23rd, 1879. I am growing very settled in my ways. Now that Tremont comes in almost every day, I'm satisfied not to see any other company. My house affairs keep me busy, too. I like to have it all nice for him. I believe I could almost be happy if he'd only smile once in a while when he meets my eye, but he never does. Oh, well, we all have our crosses, and he's a very great man. January 18th, 1880. He went to a ball last night. What does it mean? He never seemed to care for things like that. Is there any girl he's after? February 6th, 1880. Oh, he has been riding with a lady, has he? It was in the next town, and he thought I wouldn't hear. But there's little he does that I don't know about. Let him make himself sure of that. I even know her name. It is Selina Pratt. If he goes with her again, look out for a disturbance. I'll not stand his making love to another woman. May 26th, 1880. My marriage certificate is missing. Can it be that Tremont has taken it? I have looked all through the desk where I have kept it for so many years, but I cannot find it. He was left alone in the house for a few minutes the other day. Could he have taken the chance to rob me of the only proof I have that we are man and wife? If he has, he is a villain at heart, and is capable of doing anything, even of marrying this Pratt girl, who he has taken riding again. The worst is that I dare not accuse him of having my certificate, for if he didn't take it and should find out it is gone, he'd throw me off just as quick as if he had. What shall I do then? Something. He shall never marry another woman while I live. May 30th, 1880. The Pratt girl is gone. If he cared for her, it was only for a week, like an old love I could mention. I think I feel safe again, only I am convinced some one ought to know my secret besides myself. Shall it be Emily? No, I'd rather tell her mother. June 9th, 1880. I am going to Utica. I shall take these letters with me. Perhaps I shall leave them. For the last time, then, let me say, I am the lawful wife of Tremont Benjamin Orcutt, the lawyer who lives in Sibley, New York. We were married in Swanson, Nevada, on the 3rd of July, 1867, by a traveling minister named George Sinclair. Mary Ann Orcutt, Sibley, New York. End of chapter 44. Section 51 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 45. Mr. Gryce Says Goodbye. There are still many rainbows in your sky. Byron. Helen? Yes, Imogene. What noise is that? The people seem to be shouting down the street. What does it mean? Helen Richmond, who we better know as Helen Darling, looked at the worn, fever-flushed countenance of her friend, and for a moment was silent. Then she whispered, "I have not dared to tell you before, you seemed so ill. But I can tell you now, because joyous news never hurts. The people shout, because the long and tedious trial of an innocent man has come to an end. Craik Mansell was acquitted from the charge of murder this morning." "Acquitted? Oh, Helen!" "Yes, dear. Since you have been ill, very strange and solemn revelations have come to light. Mr. Orcutt—" "Ah!" cried Imogene, rising up in the great armchair in which she was half sitting and half reclining. "I know what you are going to say. I was with Mr. Orcutt when he died. I heard him myself declare that fate had spoken in his death. I believe Mr. Orcutt to have been the murderer of Mrs. Clemmens, Helen." "Yes, there can be no doubt about that," was the reply. "It has been proven, then?" "Yes." Moved to the depths of her being, Imogene covered her face with her hands. Presently she murmured, "I do not understand it. Why should such a great man as he have desired the death of a woman like her? He said it was all for my sake. What did he mean, Helen?" "Don't you know?" questioned the other, anxiously. "How should I? It is the mystery of mysteries to me." "Ah, then, you did not suspect that she was his wife?" "His wife?" Imogene rose in horror. "Yes," repeated the little bride with decision. "She was his lawfully wedded wife. They were married as long ago as when we were little children." "Married? And he dared to approach me with words of love, dared to offer himself to me as a husband while his hands were still wet with the life blood of his wife. Oh, the horror of it, the amazing wickedness and presumption of it!" "He is dead," whispered the gentle little lady at her side. With a sigh of suppressed feeling, Imogene sank back. "I must not think of him," she cried. "I am not strong enough. I must think only of Craik. He has been acquitted, you say, acquitted?" "Yes, and the whole town is rejoicing." A smile, exquisite as it was rare, swept like a sunbeam over Imogene's lips. "And I rejoice with the rest," she cried. Then, as if she felt all speech to be a mockery, she remained for a long time silent, gazing with ever deepening expression into the space before her, till Helen did not know whether the awe she felt creeping over her sprang from admiration of her companion's suddenly awakened beauty, or from a recognition of the depths of that companion's emotions. At last, Imogene spoke. "How came Mr. Mansell to be acquitted? Mr. Gryce did not tell me to look for any such reinstatement as that. The most he bade me expect was that Mr. Ferris would decline to prosecute Mr. Mansell any further, in which event he would be discharged." "I know," said Helen, "but Mr. Mansell was not satisfied with that. He demanded a verdict from the jury, so Mr. Ferris, with great generosity, asked the judge to recommend the jury to bring in a verdict of acquittal, and when the judge hesitated to do this, the foreman of the jury himself rose and intimated that he thought the jury were ready with their verdict. The judge took advantage of this, and the result was a triumphant acquittal." "Oh, Helen, Helen!" "That was just an hour ago," cried the little lady brightly, "but the people are not through shouting yet. There has been a great excitement in town these last few days." "And I knew nothing of it!" exclaimed Imogene. Suddenly she looked at Helen. "How did you hear about what took place in the courtroom to day?" she asked. "Mr. Byrd told me." "Ah, Mr. Byrd." "He came to leave a good bye for you. He goes home this afternoon." "I should like to have seen Mr. Byrd," said Imogene. "Would you?" queried the little lady, quietly shaking her head. "I don't know. I think it just as well you did not see him," said she. But she made no such demur when, a little later, Mr. Gryce was announced. The fatherly old gentleman had evidently been in that house before, and Mrs. Richmond was not the woman to withstand a man like him. He came immediately into the room where Imogene was sitting. Evidently he thought, as Helen did, that good news never hurts. "Well," he cried, taking her trembling hand in his with his most expressive smile, "what did I tell you? Didn't I say that if you would only trust me, all would come out right? And it has. Don't you see? Right as a trivet." "Yes," she returned, "and I can never find words with which to express my gratitude. You have saved two lives, Mr. Gryce, his and mine." "Pooh, pooh!" cried the detective good humoredly. "You mustn't think too much of anything I have done. It was the falling limb that did the business. If Mr. Orcutt's conscience had not been awakened by the stroke of death, I don't know where we should have been to day. Affairs were beginning to look pretty dark for Mansell." Imogene shuddered. "But I haven't come here to call up unpleasant memories," he continued. "I have come to wish you joy and a happy convalescence." And, leaning toward her, he said, with a complete change of voice, "You know, I suppose, why Mr. Mansell presumed to think you guilty of this crime?" "No," she murmured wearily, "unless it was because the ring he believed me to have retained was found on the scene of the murder." "Bah!" cried Mr. Gryce. "He had a much better reason than that." And with the air of one who wishes to clear up all misunderstandings, he told her the words which her lover had overheard Mrs. Clemmens say when he came up to her dining room door. The effect on Imogene was very great. Hoping to hide it, she turned away her face, showing in this struggle with herself something of the strength of her old days. Mr. Gryce watched her with interest. "It is very strange," was her first remark. "I had such reasons for thinking him guilty, and he had good cause for thinking me so. What wonder we doubted each other? And yet I can never forgive myself for doubting him. I can sooner forgive him for doubting me. If you see him—" "If I see him?" interrupted the detective with a smile. "Yes," said she. "If you see him, tell him that Imogene Dare thanks him for his noble conduct toward one he believed to be stained by so despicable a crime, and assure him that I think he was much more justified in his suspicions than I was in mine, for there were weaknesses in my character which he had ample opportunities for observing, while all I knew of him was to his credit." "Miss Dare," suggested the detective. Couldn't you tell him this much better yourself?" "I shall not have the opportunity," she said. "And why?" he inquired. "Mr. Mansell and I have met for the last time. A woman who has stained herself by such declarations as I made use of in court the last time I was called to the stand has created a barrier between herself and all earthly friendship. Even he for whom I perjured myself so basely cannot overleap the gulf I dug between us two that day." "But that is hard," said Mr. Gryce. "My life is hard," she answered. The wise old man, who had seen so much of life, who knew the human heart so well, smiled, but did not reply. He turned instead to another subject. "Well," he declared, "the great case is over. Sibley, satisfied with having made its mark in the world, will now rest in peace. I quit the place with some reluctance myself. 'Tis a mighty pretty spot to do business in." "You are going?" she asked. "Immediately," was the reply. "We detectives don't have much time to rest." Then, as he saw how deep a shadow lay upon her brow, added confidentially, "Miss Dare, we all have occasions for great regret. Look at me, now. Honest as I hold myself to be, I cannot blind myself to the fact that I am the possible instigator of this crime. If I had not shown Mr. Orcutt how a man like himself might perpetrate a murder without rousing suspicion, he might never have summoned up the courage to attempt it. For a detective with a conscience, that is a hard thought to bear." "But you were ignorant of what you were doing," she protested. "You had no idea there was any one present who was meditating crime." "True, but a detective shouldn't be ignorant. He ought to know men. He has opportunity enough to learn them. But I won't be caught again. Never in any company, not if it is composed of the highest dignitaries in the land, will I ever tell again how a crime of any kind can be perpetrated without risk. One always runs the chance of encountering an Orcutt." Imogene turned pale. "Do not speak of him," she cried. "I want to forget that such a man ever lived." Mr. Gryce smiled again. "It is the best thing you can do," said he. "Begin a new life, my child. Begin a new life." And with this fatherly advice he said good bye, and she saw his wise, kind face no more. The hour that followed was a dreary one for Imogene. Her joy at knowing Craik Mansell was released could not blind her to the realization of her own ruined life. Indeed, she seemed to feel it now as never before, and as the slow minutes passed, she saw in fancy the strong figure of Mansell surrounded by congratulating admirers and friends, till the full loneliness of her position swept over her, and she knew not whether to be thankful or not to the fever for having spared her blighted and dishonored life. Mrs. Richmond, seeing her so absorbed, made no attempt at consolation. She only listened, and when a step was heard, arose and went out, leaving the door open behind her. And Imogene mused on, sinking deeper and deeper into melancholy, till the tears, which for so long a time had been dried at their source, welled up to her eyes and fell slowly down her cheeks. Their touch seemed to rouse her. Standing erect, she looked quickly around, as if to see if anybody was observing her. But the room seems quite empty, and she is about to sink back again with a sigh, when her eyes fall on the doorway, and she becomes transfixed. A sturdy form is standing there, a manly, eager form, in whose beaming eyes and tender smile shine a love and a purpose which open out before her quite a different future from that which her fancy had been so ruthlessly picturing. End of chapter 45. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green